Sure. So one of the things that we saw with the election of Donald Trump was that there was a strong reaction of surprise at his election by many American women. Obviously, a good number of American women supported his election. The number which is often cited is that 52% of white women supported Donald Trump's election, but many did not support it. And in the wake of his election, it was actually within this particular demographic, the college-educated women, especially women of middle age or retirement age, often in the suburbs, really spread across the center of the country, not only in the more progressive coastal areas of the country, that became the epicenter of opposition to Donald Trump and of political organizing locally, aimed at, as many women would say, ensuring that this doesn't happen again and restoring, women would say, decency, handing a better world to our grandchildren than the one that we've created so far. One of the most interesting and underreported trends of the 2018 midterms was that actually Democrats experienced an increase of their support in some rural and blue-collar white areas. That wasn't enough of an increase to carry candidates to victory in those areas. There continues to be a broad split between urban and suburban areas where Democratic candidates routinely win now, and smaller towns and rural areas where Democratic candidates are not so strong. But the trend, which over the past decade had been towards an absolute evaporation of the Democratic presence and Democratic support among the working class white or blue collar suburbs and rural areas, that trend began to reverse here. And so the question of whether that is a momentary blip or whether we've really seen the beginnings of rebuilding of this potential strength of a Democratic Party in those blue-collar white communities, that's an open question. But that was actually where we saw the biggest shift in electoral support. The biggest shift was not in the suburbs where Democrats won. It was in the blue-collar areas and rural areas where Democrats didn't win, but came much closer than would have been than was the case 2 years ago. Sure. So voters in the November midterm election, voters of color in general turned out in very strong numbers and very strongly in support of Democratic candidates. African American voters turned out significantly higher numbers than in previous midterm elections, closer to the level of presidential elections in some places, and continue to vote very strongly as Democratic voters. Asian American voters turned out voted in larger numbers than previously had been the case, and absolutely voted in much more strongly Democratic than had been the case in previous electoral cycles. The Latino vote is more complicated. The trends with shaping the Latino vote are more complicated because you have such a geographically, in terms of class, in terms of racialized experience, you have such diversity within the Latino votes, ranging from Dominican Americans in New York City, whose voting patterns is very much like those of the African American voters they live alongside and among, to Cuban American voters within Florida, who've been traditionally the bulwark of the Republican Party there. The shifts in the rate of voting among the Latino population didn't see the degree of enhanced turnout that you might have expected to see. It certainly was there was not as much of a an increase in the proportion of voting with this midterm election. It didn't match what we saw, for instance, among African American voters. So there was an increment, but it was far less than one might have expected. And they also didn't shift towards being markedly more pro-democratic in their voting patterns. And again, I think that's a reflection of the real diversity of the US Hispanic population, which encompasses such a range of people of different class positions, people of different generation, different immigrant experiences, recent or far distant. And that diverse collective of Hispanic Americans have not reacted to the election of Donald Trump coalescing, and haven't even reacted to being often demonized in some of the rhetoric coming out of the White House, for instance, haven't reacted by becoming more uniform. They have continued to be very disparate in their own in positions, and how that evolves over time, and to what extent the Democratic Party is able to really build organizing among Latino-heavy communities is a really open question. If you look at the state of Nevada, there's extraordinary organizing that goes on there within the local Hispanic population that's been very strongly supportive of Democratic candidates, but the same is less true elsewhere. So how that evolves, for instance, in Texas will be a critical question for the short and long-term future of the Democratic Party.